a former Menshevik who became Stalin's confidant, a diplomat who persuaded the staunch anti-communist Churchill to form an alliance with the Bolsheviks, the man who organized Lend-Lease and saved millions of lives. How did a former enemy of the Bolsheviks become a key figure in Soviet diplomacy? Why did Stalin entrust him with the most important post? And now, here's a question for discussion in the comments. Was the Allies' delay in opening the Second Front justified by military necessity or a deliberate attempt to weaken the USSR? Ivan Mikhailovich Maisky arrives in the British capital at a time when relations between the USSR and Great Britain are in deep crisis. The Metropolitan Police, diplomatic receptions, prim gentlemen in top hats, all this seems infinitely far from revolutionary Moscow. But it is here, in foggy London, that the Soviet diplomat will spend 11 years that will change the course of world history. Maisky's appointment came as a surprise even to the diplomat himself. Stalin personally chose him for this post, and this choice was far from accidental. London required a special approach. Methods of direct pressure or ideological confrontation did not work here. British diplomacy had honed the art of subtle maneuvering, understatement, and backroom deals over centuries. They needed someone who could speak to the British in their own language, not just literally. Ivan Maisky was fluent in English. Moreover, he knew British culture, history, and literature. The years he spent in exile in London before the revolution gave him something that other Soviet diplomats did not have: an understanding of how the British elite thought. He read the same books as members of parliament, quoted the same poets as the lords, and understood subtle English humor. This made him one of their own in a foreign world. But behind his respectable exterior lay a revolutionary past. Maisky was a Menshevik, an opponent of the Bolsheviks in the Civil War. How could such a man become Stalin's confidant? This paradox intrigued not only British intelligence, but also the Soviet diplomats themselves. A Menshevik as ambassador of a Bolshevik state. Wasn't that absurd? But Stalin saw beyond ideological labels. He needed results. The first months in London proved to be a test. British society viewed the USSR with suspicion and fear. The communist threat, mass repression, collectivization, all this shaped the image of the Soviet Union as a barbaric country, alien to European values. Maisky had to change this perception, find common ground, and build bridges of trust. The task seemed impossible. The Soviet embassy on Kensington Palace Gardens became his headquarters for the next 11 years. From here, Maisky began his campaign to win over British public opinion. He understood that in Great Britain, decisions were not made only in government offices. Parliament, the press, public organizations, and the salons of influential ladies, all these institutions shaped the country's politics. It was necessary to act on all fronts simultaneously. First, Maisky established contacts with journalists. He gave interviews, organized press conferences, and patiently explained the USSR's position on international issues. Unlike many Soviet diplomats, he did not read prepared statements, but engaged in lively dialogue, answered tough questions, and did not shy away from uncomfortable topics. British journalists appreciated this. For the first time, they had met a Soviet representative with whom they could talk. At the same time, he worked with parliamentarians. Maisky methodically built relationships with members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Lunches, tea parties, informal conversations, all this routine of British political life required enormous patience and tact. But it was here, over a cup of tea, that issues were decided which were then discussed in official negotiations. Maisky became a regular in the corridors of Parliament. The ambassador paid particular attention to left-wing political forces. The Labour Party, trade unions, intellectual circles, all of them were potential allies of the USSR. Maisky understood that the conservatives would never become friends of the Soviet Union, but the left could be a bridge to cooperation. He regularly met with labor leaders, spoke at their meetings, and published articles in left-wing publications. But there was another side to his work, a secret one. Maisky maintained contact with British communists, helped organize campaigns in support of the USSR, and coordinated the activities of pro-Soviet organizations. British counterintelligence closely monitored these activities, but Maisky acted cautiously, not crossing the line that could lead to a diplomatic scandal. The balance between open diplomacy and covert influence required precision. Meanwhile, the international situation was rapidly deteriorating. Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933 changed the entire balance of power in Europe. The fascist threat was becoming a reality. Maisky was given a new task: to convince the British government of the need to create a collective security system against Nazi Germany. It was a mission on which the fate of Europe depended. But London was in no hurry. The British elite saw Hitler as a lesser evil compared to Stalin. Anti-communism was so strong that many politicians were willing to turn a blind eye to the aggressiveness of the Nazi regime. Maisky had to break this logic and prove that fascism was a threat not only to the USSR, but to all of Europe. It was a battle for the minds of the British elite, and time was working against him. Ivan Maisky was born in 1884 in Omsk into the family of a military doctor. His real surname was Lyakovetsky. The path to a diplomatic career was long and winding, full of unexpected turns. Young Ivan became fascinated with revolutionary ideas at an early age, which was typical for educated young people in Russia at that time. But unlike many of his peers, he chose not the path of a terrorist bomber, but the path of political struggle and intellectual resistance to autocracy. In 1903, after being arrested for revolutionary activities, Maisky emigrated to Europe. Here, in exile, he encountered the Western world for the first time, its freedoms, contradictions, and political culture. The young revolutionary immersed himself in the study of European social democracy, read Marx and Engels in the original, and argued with his comrades about the future of Russia. It was then that he joined the Mensheviks, a faction of the RSDLP that advocated a gradual evolutionary path to socialism. London became his second home long before he returned here as ambassador. From 1912 to 1917, Maisky lived in the British capital, working as a journalist and studying English language and culture. He wandered the streets of Soho, visited the British Museum Library, listened to debates in Hyde Park, and soaked up the atmosphere of a country that seemed to embody parliamentary democracy and civil liberties. These years gave him invaluable experience. When the revolution broke out in Russia in February 1917, Maisky immediately returned to his homeland. The Mensheviks had a chance to put their ideas into practice. The provisional government included many of their representatives. Maisky worked in Samara, organizing local government, believing in the possibility of democratic development in Russia. But history decided otherwise. The Bolsheviks' October coup destroyed all these hopes. The Civil War forced Maisky to make a choice. The Mensheviks found themselves caught between two fires. The whites considered them Reds, while the Reds called them counter-revolutionaries. Maisky joined the Komuch government in Samara, which attempted to create a democratic alternative to both the Bolsheviks and the White Guards. It was a utopia. Komuch lasted only a few months. After its defeat, Maisky fled to the Far East, where he became Minister of Labor in the government of the Far Eastern Republic. The Far Eastern Republic was a unique entity, a buffer state between Soviet Russia and Japan. Here, Maisky tried his hand at diplomacy for the first time, participating in negotiations with the Japanese occupation authorities. He learned the art of compromise, striking a balance between principle and pragmatism. These skills came in handy later when he began representing the interests of the USSR on the international stage. In 1921, a turning point occurred. Maisky made a decision that determined his entire future. He broke with Menshevism and joined the Bolshevik Party. The motives behind this step are still debated. Was it a careerist's calculation or a sincere belief that the future belonged to the Bolsheviks? Maisky himself explained it as disappointment with Menshevik tactics and a belief that the Bolsheviks would be able to build a new society. Critics saw it as a betrayal of ideals. The Bolsheviks treated the defector with caution. Former Mensheviks were always under suspicion. Their loyalty was tested for years, but Maisky proved useful. His career developed rapidly. By the end of the 1920s, Maisky was already a recognized expert on international affairs. He wrote articles for Soviet newspapers, gave lectures, and analyzed the international situation. It was an important post. Relations with the northern neighbor required special tact. Maisky successfully coped with the task, established contacts with the Finnish government, and resolved several border conflicts. His reports to Moscow were accurate and balanced, without exaggeration or panic, but also without embellishment. Such personnel were highly valued. When the question arose of appointing a new ambassador to London, the choice fell on Maisky. It was logical. Who better than a former emigrant who had lived in London for 5 years could represent the USSR in Great Britain? His Menshevik past, which could have been an obstacle, on the contrary, played a positive role. The British were more sympathetic to the Mensheviks than to the Bolsheviks. A man who had once opposed Lenin seemed less dangerous to them. Maisky himself was well aware of the ambiguity of his position. He served a regime that had destroyed his former comrades. Many Mensheviks had been shot or were in camps. He knew this, but continued to work. Was it weakness? Or was it the willpower of a man who chose to serve the state rather than his personal convictions? History does not provide a clear answer to this question. Arriving in London in the fall of 1932, Maisky understood that he had been given a chance to put into practice everything he had learned during years of revolutions, wars, and diplomatic work. Britain was the world's leading power, the heart of a vast empire. Success or failure here would determine the fate of Soviet foreign policy in Europe. Maisky could not afford to make mistakes, and he knew that his past would either be his trump card or his curse. Everything depended on how he played this game. The first weeks in London showed Maisky the scale of the work ahead. The Soviet embassy kept its distance from the diplomatic community. Official receptions to which the Soviet ambassador was invited were rare and cold. The British elite demonstratively distanced themselves from the representative of a country where property was nationalized and aristocrats were shot. Maisky needed to break through this wall of alienation, but how to do so remained unclear. The ambassador began by studying the balance of power in the British establishment. Who makes the decisions? Who influences public opinion? Which interest groups determine foreign policy? Maisky drew up a detailed map of the British elite. Politicians, industrialists, journalists, intellectuals. Each of them could become either an ally or an opponent of the USSR. The task was to expand the circle of allies and neutralize opponents. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. Maisky received an invitation to speak at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, a prestigious organization where the most important issues of world politics were discussed. It was a rare opportunity to address the British intellectual elite directly. The ambassador prepared thoroughly for his speech. The text was rewritten several times, and each phrase was carefully weighed. It was necessary to find a balance between defending the Soviet position and showing respect for the audience. The speech was a success. Maisky spoke calmly, without aggression, presented facts, and answered questions openly. The British public appreciated this. For the first time, they heard a Soviet diplomat who did not read propaganda cliches, but engaged in meaningful conversation. After the lecture, people approached Maisky with questions, conversations began, and business cards were exchanged. This was the first step towards recognition. The next important step was working with the press. British newspapers shaped public opinion, and Maisky understood that without them, victory would be impossible. He began giving regular interviews, inviting journalists to press conferences, and organizing trips to the USSR for British correspondents. Not all publications were friendly, but the main goal was achieved. The USSR ceased to be an abstract threat and became a real country with concrete policies. Maisky paid particular attention to the left-wing press. Newspapers such as the Daily Herald and the New Statesman were willing to publish material sympathetic to the USSR. The ambassador regularly met with their editors, provided exclusive information, and helped arrange interviews with Soviet leaders. These publications became a mouthpiece for the Soviet point of view in the British information space. Their influence grew gradually but steadily. At the same time, he worked with parliamentarians. Maisky methodically built relationships with members of the House of Commons. He hosted dinners for small groups of MPs, invited them to the embassy for informal talks, and visited their constituencies. British politicians appreciated such attention. The Soviet ambassador was more accessible than many of his colleagues. Gradually, a circle of parliamentarians formed who were willing to listen to the Soviet position and sometimes even support it. Maisky was particularly successful among labor politicians. The Labor Party was in opposition, but was an influential force. Its leaders, Clement Attlee, Stafford Cripps, and Hugh Dalton, became frequent guests at the Soviet embassy. It was possible to speak frankly with them, discussing not only current issues, but also the prospects for the development of Soviet-British relations. Labor politicians saw the USSR as a socialist experiment worthy of study, even though they did not agree with all the methods of the Bolsheviks. Maisky also established contacts with trade unions. The British labor movement was a powerful force, and the ambassador understood its importance. He spoke at trade union congresses, met with trade union leaders, and supported campaigns of solidarity with Soviet workers. Trade union activists became defenders of the USSR in disputes with employers and conservatives. This was a support that could be relied upon in difficult times. London's social life became part of diplomatic work. Maisky and his wife Agnia began attending the salons of influential ladies such as Sybil Colfax, Margot Asquith, and Emerald Cunard. Here, in an informal setting, over a cup of tea, they discussed issues of high politics. The hostesses of these salons were not just socialites. They were related or friends with the political elite. A word spoken in the salon could influence a decision in parliament. Agnia Maisky played an important role in this work. Charming, educated, and fluent in English, she quickly became a popular figure in London society. British ladies accepted her as one of their own, invited her to tea parties, and shared news and gossip with her. Through these informal channels, the Maiskys obtained information that never appeared in official documents. The diplomacy of the married couple proved to be no less effective than official negotiations. By the end of his first year in London, Maisky had achieved his main goal. The USSR was no longer an outcast in British society. Of course, there were still many opponents, and conservatives continued to view the Bolsheviks with hatred. But there were also those who were willing to listen and discuss. The dialogue had begun. It was a modest but real achievement. Maisky laid the foundation for future successes, although years of hard work and many trials lay ahead. But the first step had been taken. The year 1933 brought disturbing news from Germany. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler became Reich Chancellor. Europe did not immediately realize the scale of the catastrophe, but Maisky understood that the world had changed forever. The Nazis' rise to power meant the end of the Versailles system and the beginning of a new era of conflict. The USSR faced a real threat, and the task of the Soviet ambassador in London took on new urgency: to convince the British government of the need to jointly oppose fascism. But London viewed events in Germany differently. For many British conservatives, Hitler was the lesser evil compared to Stalin. Nazi Germany was seen as a bulwark against the spread of communism in Europe. Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald and Foreign Minister John Simon adhered to a policy of appeasement. They hoped that it would be possible to negotiate with Hitler by satisfying some of his demands. May was tasked with shattering this illusion. Soviet diplomacy put forward the idea of creating a collective security system in Europe. The essence of the proposal was simple. All countries threatened by fascist aggression should unite for joint defense. The USSR proposed concluding mutual assistance agreements with France, Poland, and the countries of the Little Entente. Maisky was instructed to secure Britain's participation in this system. The task seemed feasible, as Britain was also interested in maintaining the European balance of power. The first negotiations revealed the complexity of the situation. The Foreign Office reacted to the Soviet proposals with cold skepticism. British diplomats did not trust the USSR and considered collective security to be a trap into which the Bolsheviks wanted to lure Britain for their own purposes. In addition, there was a fear that an alliance with the USSR would alienate Germany and push it toward even greater aggression. The logic was flawed, but it dominated the British establishment. May tried to appeal to common sense. He wrote memoranda arguing that fascism was a threat not only to the USSR, but to all of Europe, including Britain. He organized meetings with ministers, explaining that weakness toward Hitler only whetted his appetite. He published articles in the British press analyzing the danger of Nazi ideology. But all this was met with a wall of misunderstanding and prejudice. The situation was complicated by the fact that Stalin was playing a double game. On the one hand, the USSR publicly advocated collective security and anti-fascist unity. On the other hand, Moscow did not rule out the possibility of reaching an agreement with Hitler if the West refused to cooperate with the Soviet Union. Maisky knew only part of these plans. Stalin did not trust diplomats with full information. The ambassador had to convince the British of the sincerity of the Soviet proposals, without knowing himself how sincere they were. In 1934, the USSR was admitted to the League of Nations. This was a diplomatic success. The Soviet Union was emerging from international isolation and becoming part of the European security system. Maisky worked actively to ensure that the British government supported this decision. He argued that the USSR's presence in the League would strengthen the organization and make it more effective in confronting aggressors. Britain ultimately did not object. It was a small step forward. Meanwhile, Hitler was gaining strength. Germany withdrew from the League of Nations, began rearming, and introduced universal conscription. The Versailles restrictions were being violated one after another, and the Western powers limited themselves to verbal protests. May watched this process with concern. He saw that time was working against peace, that every month of delay made Hitler stronger. But he was unable to convince the British to act decisively. In 1935, an event occurred that exposed the weakness of the League of Nations. Italy attacked Ethiopia. The League condemned the aggression and imposed economic sanctions against Italy. But they were half-hearted and ineffective. Most importantly, Britain and France did not dare to take tough measures, fearing that they would alienate Mussolini and push him into an alliance with Hitler. Ethiopia was left to fend for itself. For Maisky, this was a lesson. The West was not ready to defend the principles of collective security. The next blow was the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936. Hitler violated the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Agreements by sending troops into the demilitarized zone. This was a moment when the aggressor could still have been stopped with little bloodshed. The German army was weak, and French troops outnumbered it many times over. But France did not dare to act without British support, and Britain preferred not to intervene. Maisky was shocked by this capitulation. The Soviet ambassador increasingly felt like Cassandra. He predicted disaster, but no one listened. His reports to Moscow became increasingly gloomy. He wrote that the West was not ready for serious resistance to Hitler, that the policy of appeasement was leading to war, and that the USSR should prepare for the worst. Stalin read these reports and drew his own conclusions. Maisky did not know at the time that these conclusions would lead to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but he intuitively felt that something was wrong. The civil war in Spain, which began in the summer of 1936, became a new test for collective security. The USSR supported the Republican government with weapons and volunteers, hoping to stop fascism on the Iberian Peninsula. But Britain and France declared non-intervention, effectively handing Spain over to Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini. Maisky tried to organize a campaign of solidarity with the Spanish Republicans in Britain, but official policy remained unchanged. Maisky understood this, but continued his mission, hoping that sooner or later Britain would realize the danger. Even more difficult trials lay ahead. Munich, the pact with Hitler, the beginning of the war. But for now, the ambassador believed that diplomacy could still change something. This belief would soon be put to a cruel test. On September 29, 1938, an agreement was signed in Munich that went down in history as a symbol of betrayal and capitulation to the aggressor. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier agreed to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, handing over the Sudetenland to Hitler. The Czechoslovak government was not even invited to the negotiations. The fate of the country was decided without its participation. For Maisky, Munich was a personal disaster. All hopes for collective security had collapsed. The Soviet Union was not invited to Munich. It was a demonstrative humiliation. The USSR was excluded from the negotiations on the fate of Europe. Stalin took this as proof that the West was ready to negotiate with Hitler at the expense of the Eastern countries. Maisky tried to protest, meeting with British politicians and explaining that an agreement with Hitler was an illusion. No one listened to him. Chamberlain returned from Munich with a piece of paper on which Hitler promised peace and announced the achievement of peace for our time. Maisky knew this was a lie. He understood Hitler's psychology better than the British aristocrats. The Führer perceived concessions as weakness, and weakness provoked new aggression. The fate of Czechoslovakia was sealed. The country lost its fortifications, its industry, and its ability to defend itself. The next step would be complete absorption. Maisky wrote about this to Moscow, warning that Munich was not the end, but the beginning. Stalin read these reports and prepared for the worst. The atmosphere in London after Munich was festive. War had been postponed, Hitler was satisfied, and everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. Maisky attended receptions where Chamberlain was praised as a peacemaker. He heard talk that Germany would now turn eastward against the USSR and that Britain would remain on the sidelines. This was the logic that led to World War II, the hope that one aggressor could be turned against another. The ambassador understood that trust in the West had been irrevocably undermined. Maisky's relationship with the Foreign Office became tense. British diplomats felt that the Soviet ambassador looked down on them with contempt, and so he did. Maisky truly despised those who had betrayed Czechoslovakia. But diplomatic protocol required him to remain polite. The ambassador continued to meet with ministers and discuss current issues, but his former enthusiasm had disappeared. He worked out of inertia, following Moscow's instructions, but he had no faith in the outcome. On March 15, 1939, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement was torn up by Hitler himself. He didn't even give it 6 months. British society was shocked. Illusions collapsed instantly. Chamberlain publicly admitted that he had been wrong to trust the Führer. May could have said, "I warned you," but he remained silent. It was not yet time to celebrate. Even more terrible events lay ahead. After the occupation of Czechoslovakia, British policy began to change. The government announced guarantees to Poland. In the event of a German attack, Britain would enter the war. This was a turning point that Maisky had been striving for years. It seemed that the West was finally ready to confront the aggressor. Negotiations began on a possible Anglo-Franco-Soviet alliance. Maisky was instructed to seek specific military agreements. Hope loomed ahead. Negotiations began in the spring of 1939. Maisky met with Foreign Minister Lord Halifax to discuss the terms of the alliance. The USSR offered clear military commitments. In the event of aggression against any of the parties, the others would enter the war. But the British dragged their feet, put forward counter-conditions, and demanded guarantees that were unacceptable to Moscow. The negotiations turned into a bargaining session, with each side trying to shift responsibility onto the other. The main stumbling block was the issue of Poland and the Baltic states. The USSR insisted that, in order to effectively defend against Germany, Soviet troops must have the right to pass through Polish territory. The Poles categorically refused. They feared Soviet occupation no less than German occupation. Britain could not force Poland to agree. The negotiations reached an impasse. Maisky sensed that something was amiss. In the summer of 1939, an Anglo-French military mission arrived in Moscow to discuss specific plans for cooperation. Maisky had high hopes for these negotiations. Perhaps the military would be able to reach an agreement where the diplomats had failed. But the mission arrived without the authority to sign agreements, and its members had no clear plan of action. Stalin took this as further proof of the insincerity of Western intentions. The decision was made. On August 23, 1939, the world learned of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The USSR and Germany signed a non-aggression treaty. For Europe, it was a shock. For Maisky, it was a tragedy. All his work to create an anti-Hitler alliance collapsed overnight. The ambassador learned of the pact from radio reports. Moscow did not deem it necessary to warn him in advance. He had to explain to the British what he himself did not understand and did not accept. The reaction in London was predictable. Anger, accusations of betrayal, comparisons of Stalin to Hitler. Maisky was summoned to the Foreign Office and asked for an explanation. He repeated the official version. The USSR had been forced to ensure its own security because the West had refused to form a real alliance. This was true, but not the whole truth. The secret protocol on the division of Eastern Europe remained a secret. Maisky did not know about it, but he guessed. The position of the Soviet ambassador in London became unbearable. He was no longer invited to receptions, diplomats avoided meetings with him, and the press published scathing articles. Maisky found himself isolated, a representative of a country that had betrayed the common cause. He continued to work, wrote reports, and met with the few who were still willing to talk to him. But it was an existence in a vacuum. On September 1st, Germany attacked Poland. World War II began. August 23, 1939, divided Maisky's life into before and after. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact turned the Soviet ambassador from an active participant in European diplomacy into an outcast. British society perceived the agreement with Hitler as a betrayal. Newspapers wrote about the collusion of totalitarian regimes, and cartoonists depicted Stalin and Hitler as twin brothers. Maisky found himself at the center of a diplomatic scandal from which there was no escape. The first days after the announcement of the pact were a nightmare. The phone at the embassy never stopped ringing. Journalists demanded comments. Politicians demanded explanations. Former friends turned their backs. The Foreign Office summoned Maisky for an official démarche. The British government expressed its outrage at the actions of the USSR. The ambassador listened to the reproaches and tried to explain the logic behind the Soviet actions. But even to him, his arguments sounded weak. The truth was that Stalin had chosen a deal with Hitler over an alliance with the West. On September 17th, Soviet troops entered eastern Poland. Officially, this was called the liberation of Western Ukrainians and Belarusians, but the world saw it as the division of Poland between two dictators. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, but the USSR remained neutral. Moreover, it supplied Germany with oil, grain, and strategic raw materials. Maisky had to explain the inexplicable: how the USSR could help the aggressor that had attacked Poland. Relations with the British government had reached a freezing point. Chamberlain was considering breaking off diplomatic relations with the USSR. Only pragmatism prevented him from taking this step. A complete break would mean the loss of the last channels of influence on Soviet policy. Maisky continued to send reports to Moscow, but they remained unanswered. Stalin had bet on Germany and did not need the advice of diplomats. On November 30th, the Soviet-Finnish War began. It was the final blow to the USSR's reputation. The attack on tiny Finland caused a wave of outrage around the world. The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union from its ranks, the only such expulsion in the organization's history. Britain considered providing military aid to Finland. Maisky tried to prevent escalation, but his influence was close to zero. The winter of 1939-1940 was the most difficult period in Maisky's life. He felt like the captain of a ship rushing toward the rocks, but the captain was not listening to the warnings. The USSR had become an international pariah, an ally of Nazi Germany. All the work to create an anti-Hitler coalition had been in vain. The ambassador continued to perform his formal duties, but he understood that his mission had failed. His only consolation was meeting with left-wing politicians. laborites, trade union activists, intellectuals. Many of them retained their sympathy for the USSR despite the pact with Hitler. They explained Soviet actions as fear of the capitalist encirclement, blaming Munich and the West's betrayal of Czechoslovakia. May clung to this support like a lifeline. At least someone else still believed in the USSR. In the spring of 1940, the situation changed. Germany attacked Denmark and Norway, followed by an offensive on the Western Front. France surrendered in 6 weeks. Britain was left alone to face Hitler. On May 10th, Chamberlain resigned, and Winston Churchill, an uncompromising opponent of both Nazism and communism, became the new prime minister. Maisky had known Churchill for years, but their relationship was cold. The defeat of France came as a shock to Europe. It seemed incredible that a great power with a powerful army could fall so quickly. Britain was preparing for invasion, forming militia units and evacuating children. Maisky watched the events with concern. If Germany defeated Britain, the USSR would find itself alone against Hitler. Stalin understood this and continued to appease the Führer with supplies, hoping to delay the inevitable. In the summer of 1940, the USSR annexed the Baltic states and Bessarabia. Britain lodged a formal protest, but was preoccupied with its own survival. The Battle of Britain was raging in the skies above London. German aircraft were bombing cities, and fighter planes were battling over the English Channel. Maisky, along with Londoners, went down into bomb shelters during the raids, saw destroyed houses, and heard explosions. War had come to the British capital. The paradox was that the common danger began to bring the USSR and Britain closer together. Churchill hated communism, but he was a pragmatist. He understood that sooner or later, Hitler would attack the USSR, and then Britain would have an ally. Maisky sensed these sentiments, tried to renew contacts, and hinted at the possibility of cooperation. But officially, the USSR remained neutral, even friendly toward Germany. In the fall of 1940, Molotov visited Berlin for talks with Hitler. The USSR was offered to join the tripartite pact of Germany, Italy, and Japan to divide the world into spheres of influence. Maisky learned about these negotiations from the press and was shocked. Was Stalin seriously considering an alliance with Hitler? But the negotiations failed. The parties' appetites did not coincide. Hitler was already preparing Operation Barbarossa. The winter of 1940-1941 passed in anxious anticipation. Maisky received alarming signals from various sources. The Germans were pulling troops to the Soviet border, conducting aerial photography, and building warehouses and airfields. He passed this information on to Moscow, but Stalin did not believe in the possibility of an attack. The leader believed that Hitler would not start a war on two fronts until he had defeated Britain. Maisky understood that disaster was inevitable. All that remained was to wait. June 22, 1941, began like any other Sunday. London went about its business, unaware that at that very moment, a war that would change everything had begun in Eastern Europe. Maisky learned of Germany's attack on the USSR early in the morning from a phone call from an embassy advisor. His first reaction was shock. Despite all the warnings, despite the obviousness of it, he was not mentally prepared for this. The war had begun. By noon, the news had spread throughout London. The reaction of British society was unexpected for Maisky. Not malice, but sympathy. People remembered how a year ago the USSR had signed a pact with Hitler. But now, that didn't matter. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Soviet Union became Britain's ally automatically, without any negotiations or agreements. A common enemy instantly united irreconcilable adversaries. On the evening of June 22nd, Churchill addressed the nation on the radio. Maisky listened to the Prime Minister's speech with excitement. Churchill did not hide his attitude toward communism. He hated it as much as ever. But, he said, if Hitler invaded hell, I would find a good word for the devil in the House of Commons. Britain would provide the USSR with all possible assistance in the fight against Nazi Germany. It was a historic speech. On June 23rd, Maisky was invited to the Prime Minister's residence on Downing Street. The meeting with Churchill took place in a tense but businesslike atmosphere. The Prime Minister assured the ambassador that Britain would do everything possible to support the USSR. Maisky thanked him and conveyed Stalin's request for military supplies and the opening of a second front in Europe. Churchill promised supplies, but was cautious about the second front. Britain was not ready to invade continental Europe. The atmosphere around the Soviet embassy changed instantly. Yesterday's enemies became allies. British newspapers published sympathetic articles about the heroic resistance of the Red Army. Politicians lined up to meet with Maisky. The ambassador went from being an outcast to one of the most important diplomats in London. It was a dizzying turn of events, for which he was not psychologically prepared. The first weeks of the war were disastrous for the USSR. German tank wedges broke through the front, surrounded entire armies, and captured vast territories. The Western press published Wehrmacht reports of hundreds of thousands of prisoners and thousands of destroyed tanks and aircraft. Analysts predicted the fall of Moscow in 2 to 3 months. Maisky read these forecasts with horror. What if they were right? What if the USSR repeated the fate of France? Maisky's main task was to organize military aid. Britain promised to supply weapons, ammunition, and strategic materials, but many technical issues had to be resolved. What cargo? By what route? In what quantities? Maisky worked 18 hours a day, meeting with ministers, military leaders, and industrialists. Every tank and every aircraft sent to the USSR could save the lives of Soviet soldiers. The Northern Sea route through Murmansk and Arkhangelsk became the main artery of aid. British convoys delivered cargo to Soviet ports under the constant threat of attack by German submarines and aircraft. Maisky monitored every convoy, rejoiced at every successful arrival, and mourned the sunken ships. These convoys were not just cargo. They were a symbol of the alliance, proof that the USSR was not alone in the struggle. July and August brought new disasters. Smolensk fell, the blockade of Leningrad began, and the Germans were pushing towards Moscow. The British press wrote about the inevitable defeat of the USSR. Maisky publicly expressed confidence in victory, but doubts gnawed at him. He had seen the maps, knew the numbers of casualties, and understood the scale of the disaster. The only hope was that the USSR was not France. Its territory was vast, its resources inexhaustible, and its people ready to fight. In September, Maisky was instructed to seek Britain's recognition of the Soviet borders of 1941, with the annexed Baltic states, Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and Bessarabia. This was a difficult issue. Britain did not recognize these annexations, considering them the result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But Stalin insisted, and Maisky had to convince the British that territorial issues needed to be resolved immediately. Negotiations on borders were difficult. Churchill understood the importance of an alliance with the USSR, but did not want to sanction the annexations. The Foreign Office took a tough stance. No recognition of the seizures. Maisky used all his diplomatic skills to convince them that this was a matter of Soviet security, that without a resolution of territorial disputes, a full-fledged alliance would be impossible. The British did not agree and postponed the decision for the future. Meanwhile, the Germans approached Moscow. October 1941 became a critical month. The battle for the capital decided the fate of the war. Maisky anxiously followed the reports, expecting news of the fall of Moscow every day. But the city held out. Soviet troops fought with desperate bravery, and for the first time since the beginning of the war, the German offensive stalled. In London, people began to believe that perhaps the USSR would hold out. Maisky's personal acquaintance with Churchill began long before the war, but a real relationship only developed after June 22, 1941. Winston Churchill was a controversial figure, a brilliant orator and writer, an uncompromising anti-communist, and a pragmatic politician. He hated Bolshevism with all his heart, participated in the intervention during the Civil War, and called the USSR a barbaric regime. But he hated Hitler even more. Maisky understood that Churchill would never become a friend of the Soviet Union, but he could become a reliable ally against a common enemy. The Prime Minister thought in terms of British interests, and at that moment, those interests coincided with Soviet interests. The defeat of Germany was the goal of both countries. Everything else could be put off until later. This commonality of goals created the basis for cooperation. The first meetings were tense. Churchill viewed Maisky as a representative of a regime that had been friendly with Hitler a year earlier. The ambassador sensed this distrust, but did not take offense. He himself did not trust the British after Munich. But both understood that personal sympathies were not important. Victory was important. And gradually, the ice began to melt. Churchill appreciated Maisky's professionalism, his knowledge of British politics, and his negotiating skills. In the fall of 1941, relations reached a new level. Churchill invited Maisky to a private dinner at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence. This was a sign of special trust. Only close friends were invited to such dinners. Maisky arrived excited, not knowing what to expect. The evening turned out to be informal and frank. Churchill told military stories, quoted poets, drank whiskey, and smoked cigars. The ambassador kept up the conversation, demonstrating his knowledge of English literature and history. The conversation gradually turned to serious issues. Churchill asked directly whether the USSR would hold out. Maisky replied with confidence that it would. The Soviet people would not give up. The territory was vast, and the resources were great. Hitler had made the same mistake as Napoleon. He had underestimated Russia. The Prime Minister listened attentively, asking clarifying questions about mobilization capabilities, industrial potential, and the morale of the army. Maisky answered honestly, not hiding the difficulties, but emphasizing his determination. Churchill promised maximum assistance. Britain would send tanks, planes, trucks, aluminum, rubber, everything it could, to the USSR. Convoys would run regularly, despite losses. But the Prime Minister was frank about the Second Front. Britain could not yet land in France. The army was not strong enough. The Navy was busy defending communications, and the Air Force was fighting over Britain and in Africa. Time is needed. Maisky insisted that every month of delay costs thousands of Soviet soldiers' lives. Churchill understood this, but could not change reality. December 1941 brought two events that changed the course of the war. On December 5th, the Soviet counteroffensive began near Moscow, resulting in the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht. On December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the war. The anti-Hitler coalition was taking shape. Maisky sensed that a turning point was coming. Germany was no longer invincible. After the Battle of Moscow, attitudes toward the USSR in Britain changed permanently. The Red Army had proven its combat effectiveness, dispelling the myth of the weakness of Soviet troops. The British press published enthusiastic articles about the heroism of Soviet soldiers. Rallies were held in London in support of the USSR, and funds were raised to aid the Red Army. Maisky spoke at these rallies, thanking the British people for their support and calling for a strengthening of the alliance. Churchill became increasingly candid in his conversations with Maisky. He shared his plans, discussed war strategy, and asked for advice. The Prime Minister understood that victory was impossible without the USSR. The main burden of the war fell on the Soviet people, with German divisions being crushed on the Eastern Front. Britain could help with supplies, aviation, and the Navy, but the decisive battles were being fought in Russia. In the spring of 1942, Maisky was given a new task: to secure the signing of an alliance treaty between the USSR and Great Britain. Stalin insisted on the legal formalization of the alliance, on mutual obligations of assistance and post-war cooperation. Maisky began negotiations with Foreign Minister Eden. The main stumbling block remained the issue of borders. The USSR demanded recognition of the annexations of 1940. The negotiations were difficult. Britain did not want to recognize Soviet territorial acquisitions, especially the annexation of the Baltic states. The United States also objected. The American government adhered to the principle of non-recognition of territorial changes resulting from the war. Maisky found himself between a rock and a hard place. Stalin demanded results, while the British refused to yield. The ambassador sought a compromise, proposed various formulations, and tried to find a solution that would satisfy both sides. On May 26, 1942, the treaty was signed. The territorial issue remained unresolved. It was put on hold, postponed until after the war. The treaty provided for military cooperation against Germany and its allies, a commitment not to conclude a separate peace, and post-war economic cooperation. It was an important success for Soviet diplomacy. Maisky could celebrate victory, but the main issue remained the Second Front. Stalin demanded an immediate landing in Europe to draw some German forces away from the Eastern Front. Maisky raised this issue at every meeting with Churchill. The Prime Minister promised, evaded, explained the difficulties. In the spring of 1942, he made it clear that the landing might take place in the fall. Maisky conveyed this to Moscow as a promise. The summer of 1942 brought disappointment. There was no landing. Instead, the British and Americans launched an operation in North Africa. Churchill explained to Maisky that this was also a second front, distracting German forces, but the ambassador knew that only a few German divisions were fighting in Africa, while hundreds were fighting in the east. Stalin was furious, accusing the Allies of cowardice and betrayal. Maisky's relationship with Churchill weathered this crisis. The Prime Minister was honest. He did not promise what he could not deliver. Britain was simply not ready for a large-scale amphibious operation. It needed ships, trained troops, and air superiority. All this took time. Maisky understood this rationally, but emotionally it was difficult to convey the refusals to Moscow. By the end of 1942, Maisky and Churchill had developed an almost friendly personal relationship. They met regularly to discuss not only the war, but also the post-war world order. Churchill valued the ambassador's honesty, his knowledge of British politics, and his ability to find compromises. Maisky admired the Prime Minister's strength of character and his unyielding will to win. They were allies by necessity, but their alliance grew stronger with each month of the war. The question of a second front became the main topic of Maisky's negotiations in 1942-1943. Every day, thousands of Soviet soldiers were dying on the Eastern Front, and Stalin demanded concrete action from the Allies. The opening of a second front in Western Europe was supposed to force Hitler to transfer some of his troops from the east, easing the situation for the Red Army. But the Allies were in no hurry. Maisky used all available channels of influence. He met with ministers, parliamentarians, and military leaders. He spoke at public events, gave interviews, and wrote articles. His main argument was simple and convincing. The USSR was bearing the brunt of the war, losing millions of people and fighting most of the German army. The Allies were obliged to help with real military action, not just supplies. British society supported the idea of a second front. Trade unions organized rallies demanding an immediate landing in Europe. The left-wing press published articles criticizing the government for its slowness. Labor, on the one hand, there were Stalin's demands and public opinion, and on the other, the reality of the military situation. The British Army was not strong enough for a large-scale amphibious operation. An attempt at a premature landing could end in disaster, as the Dieppe raid in August 1942 had shown. At that time, Canadian troops suffered heavy losses without achieving any results. Churchill did not want a repeat of this fiasco. The compromise was a landing in North Africa in November 1942. Operation Torch opened a new theater of war against German and Italian troops. Churchill convinced Maisky that this was a real second front that would force Hitler to spread his forces thin. But the ambassador knew the truth. Only a few enemy divisions were fighting in Africa. This could not seriously affect the situation in the east. Stalin did not accept the African campaign as a second front. In his messages to Churchill, he wrote directly that the second front should be opened in France, as only there could a decisive blow be dealt to Germany. Maisky conveyed these messages to the British government, seeing the growing irritation on both sides. The alliance was falling apart at the seams, even though they were fighting a common enemy. In the spring of 1943, hope appeared. At a conference in Washington, the Allies finally agreed on plans for a landing in Normandy. The operation was scheduled for May 1944. May reported this news to Moscow as a great success. But Stalin was dissatisfied. Another whole year to wait. During this time, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers would die. The leader suspected that the Allies were deliberately delaying, hoping that the USSR and Germany would bleed each other dry. In the summer of 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily, then in Italy. Mussolini was overthrown, and Italy withdrew from the war. Churchill triumphantly informed Maisky of these successes. Another front had been opened, and pressure on Germany was growing. The ambassador relayed the information to Moscow, but there was no enthusiasm there. He had secured the signing of an alliance treaty, organized large-scale deliveries, and established a relationship of trust with the British leadership. But the main task, opening a second front in France, remained unfulfilled. Every delay was perceived in Moscow as a betrayal by the Allies. The ambassador found himself caught between two fires. In the fall of 1943, an event occurred that changed Maisky's position. He was summoned to Moscow to participate in the Tehran Conference. It was the first meeting of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, the Big Three. Maisky prepared materials for the Soviet delegation, advised on British positions, and participated in the preparation of negotiations. The conference was supposed to decide the fate of Europe and determine the strategy for the final defeat of Germany. Lend-Lease became the material embodiment of the alliance between the USSR, Great Britain, and the United States. The tanks, planes, trucks, aluminum, rubber, food. All of this passed through his hands and required constant negotiations and agreements. The first deliveries began in the summer of 1941, even before Lend-Lease was formally established. Immediately after the war began, Churchill ordered that everything possible be sent to the USSR. Matilda and Valentine tanks, Hurricane and Spitfire fighters, anti-tank guns. The first shipments arrived in Arkhangelsk and Murmansk as early as August. The quantities were modest, but the symbolic significance was enormous. Britain was keeping its word. Organizing the deliveries was a logistical nightmare. The Northern Sea route ran along occupied Norway, under constant threat of attack from German aircraft and submarines. The convoys sailed through polar nights in winter and the midnight sun in summer, through storms and ice. Many ships sank, and cargoes were lost. Maisky received reports on each convoy, rejoicing in successes and mourning losses. The PQ-17 convoy in the summer of 1942 was particularly tragic. Fearing an attack by the German battleship Tirpitz, the British Admiralty ordered the convoy to disperse. Without protection, the merchant ships became easy prey for submarines and aircraft. Of the 35 ships, only 11 reached Soviet ports. Hundreds of sailors were killed, and tanks, aircraft, and ammunition sank to the bottom of the sea. Maisky was shocked by the scale of the disaster. After the PQ-17 tragedy, the Admiralty temporarily suspended northern convoys. Maisky fought for their resumption, arguing that without supplies, the USSR would not be able to continue the war. Churchill understood this, but had to take the opinion of the Navy into account. The losses were too great. The compromise was to send smaller convoys with increased protection. Deliveries continued, albeit in smaller volumes. Parallel to the sea deliveries, a southern route was developed, through Iran. In August 1941, Britain and the USSR sent troops into Iran, overthrew the pro-German Shah, and established control over the country. Cargo from the US and Britain began to arrive through Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf. This route was safer than the northern one, although it was longer. Maisky coordinated the work of both routes. Not all deliveries were successful. British equipment often did not meet Soviet standards. The tanks were slow and poorly armed compared to German ones. The aircraft were inferior to the new Soviet models. Maisky received complaints from Moscow, passed them on to the British, and asked them to improve quality. Britain did what it could, but its industry was working at full capacity. Supplies of strategic materials were especially valuable. Aluminum for the aviation industry, high-quality steel, and equipment for factories. Soviet enterprises evacuated to the Urals needed machine tools, instruments, and technology. Britain shared what it had. Maisky personally oversaw these deliveries, understanding their critical importance for the military economy of the USSR. Food aid saved millions of Soviet citizens from starvation. Britain sent canned food, oil, sugar, and tea. The Americans added corned beef, powdered eggs, and flour. Cargoes were sent to besieged Leningrad via the Road of Life across Lake Ladoga. Every can of food, every pound of butter meant a human life saved. Maisky understood this and thanked the British from the bottom of his heart. By the end of the war, more than 7,000 tanks, more than 5,000 aircraft, and 5,000 trucks had been delivered to the USSR through Lend-Lease from Britain alone. The US supplied even more. This aid amounted to about 10% of Soviet military production. Not a decisive contribution, but an important one nonetheless. Maisky could be proud. His efforts helped save the Soviet Union from defeat. Organizing supplies was no less an important victory than any battle. London's salons became an unexpectedly important tool of diplomacy during the war years. Maisky understood this as early as the 1930s. But during the war, the importance of informal communication increased many times over. It was here, over a cup of tea in the salons of influential ladies, that issues were discussed that were not raised in official negotiations. It was here that public opinion was formed, which then influenced political decisions. Agnia Maisky was the soul of this salon diplomacy. Charming, educated, fluent in English and English manners, she became a welcome guest in the most exquisite homes in London. The ambassador's wife frequented the salons of Sybil Colfax on Lord North Street, Emerald Cunard in Grosvenor Square, and Violet Bonham Carter in Bloomsbury. These women were not just socialites. They were centers of power and influence. Sybil Colfax was particularly important. Her salon was frequented by ministers, writers, aristocrats, and industrialists. Here one could meet Anthony Eden, Harold Nicholson, Somerset Maugham, and Noel Coward. The conversations were relaxed but touched on serious issues: war strategy, post-war arrangements, relations with the USSR. Agnia listened, memorized, and cautiously expressed her views. In the evening, she recounted everything to her husband, and this information formed the basis of reports to Moscow. Maisky himself also attended salons, although less often than his wife. His presence added a special flavor to the evenings. The Soviet ambassador among British aristocrats looked exotic, but the ambassador knew how to carry himself, quoting Shakespeare and Dickens, telling anecdotes, and engaging in small talk. At the same time, he observed carefully, noting who was friends with whom, who influenced whom, and what ideas were in the air. The Mays developed a special relationship with Sidney and Beatrice Webb, famous Fabian socialists. The Webbs sympathized with the USSR and wrote the book Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, with enthusiastic assessments of the Soviet experiment. Their home became an island of friendly warmth for the Maiskys in the cold ocean of the British establishment. Here, they could speak frankly and discuss not only politics, but also life. Through his salons, Maisky influenced the British intelligentsia. Writers, journalists, professors, all of them shaped public opinion. The ambassador patiently explained the Soviet position, answered questions, and dispelled myths. Gradually, attitudes toward the USSR changed, from hostility to understanding, from suspicion to sympathy. It was long, painstaking work, but it bore fruit. The salons gave Maisky what official channels could not: access to behind-the-scenes information. Here, people spoke more candidly than in the offices of the Foreign Office. Here, one could learn about conflicts within the government, disagreements between ministers, and the mood in Parliament. This information was invaluable for understanding the real state of affairs. The war made the salons more democratic. Old aristocratic prejudices gave way to a common danger. The Soviet ambassador, who had previously been shunned by many, was now a welcome guest. People wanted to hear firsthand about the situation on the Eastern Front, the plans of the Soviet command, and Stalin's intentions. Maisky shared information cautiously, knowing that his every word would be passed on. Tea parties and dinners in salons contrasted with the horrors of war. While London discussed poetry and music, deadly battles were raging in Russia. Maisky sometimes felt bitter about this contrast, but he understood that salon diplomacy was part of the war, even if it was fought with words rather than bullets. Every supporter won over to the USSR brought victory closer. By the end of the war, the Maiskys had become an integral part of London society. They were welcomed everywhere, their opinions were respected, and their words were listened to. It was a triumph of diplomatic skill. Representatives of a communist power had conquered the capital of capitalism not by force, but by charm, knowledge, and patience. The salons of London proved to be no less important a front in the war than the battlefields. The Tehran Conference in November-December 1943 was a turning point in World War II. For the first time, the leaders of the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, met face-to-face to agree on a strategy for the final defeat of Germany and discuss the post-war world order. Maisky played an important role in preparing for this historic meeting, although he himself was only an observer at the negotiations. Preparations began several months earlier. Maisky advised the Soviet delegation on the personalities of British politicians, their strengths and weaknesses, and their negotiating tactics. He knew Churchill better than anyone else in Moscow, understood his psychology, and could predict his reactions. This knowledge was invaluable to Stalin, who was preparing for his first meeting with Western leaders. The main issue at the conference was the opening of a second front. Stalin demanded specific dates and commitments. For 2 years, the USSR had fought alone against the main forces of the Wehrmacht, losing millions of people. It was time for the Allies to fulfill their promises. Churchill was still hesitant, proposing alternative operations in the Balkans. But Roosevelt supported the Normandy landings, and that settled the matter. Operation Overlord was scheduled for May 1944. It was a firm commitment from which there was no turning back. Stalin got what he had been striving for years. When May learned of this decision, he felt relieved. Finally, the Western Allies would shoulder part of the burden of the war. However, there were still 6 months left until May, and much could change. Territorial issues were also discussed at the conference. Stalin insisted on recognition of the Soviet western borders, including the annexed territories. Churchill did not object. He understood that after the war, the USSR would dominate Eastern Europe. Roosevelt was more cautious, but he also recognized reality. The Polish question sparked heated debate, but a final decision was postponed for the future. Maisky analyzed the results of Tehran in his reports. The conference was a success for Soviet diplomacy. A second front was promised. The USSR's territorial claims were partially recognized, and the anti-Hitler coalition was strengthened. But the ambassador understood that the real relations between the Allies were more complicated than the official communiques. Churchill did not trust Stalin. Stalin suspected Churchill, and both flirted with Roosevelt. It was a marriage of convenience, held together only by a common enemy. After Tehran, Maisky's work in London entered a new phase. Now it was no longer a question of the survival of the USSR, but of the post-war structure of Europe. Stalin wanted to create a belt of friendly states in Eastern Europe to guarantee the security of the USSR. Britain sought to maintain the balance of power on the continent. These interests were contradictory, and Maisky found himself at the center of these contradictions. The winter of 1943-1944 was spent in tense negotiations about the future of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Maisky discussed the composition of post-war governments, borders, and spheres of influence with British diplomats. It was a complex game in which each side tried to secure its interests under the guise of democratic rhetoric. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. The Second Front was opened. Maisky felt a sense of satisfaction. The goal he had been working toward for 3 years had finally been achieved. Now, Germany was fighting on 2 fronts, and its defeat was only a matter of time. The ambassador could afford to think about the future, his own future and the future of Europe after the war. But it was at the moment of triumph that Maisky's fate began to change. Changes were brewing in the diplomatic corps in Moscow. Stalin believed that the old guard had fulfilled their mission and it was time for them to retire. Maisky was not yet aware of this and continued to work with his usual enthusiasm. Ahead lay the final months of the London mission, the most successful and the most anxious. The question of the post-war structure of Europe became the main topic of diplomatic negotiations in 1944. Germany was still resisting, but its defeat was inevitable. The Allies began to divide the spoils of an unkilled bear, and the interests of the parties increasingly clashed. Maisky found himself at the epicenter of these contradictions, trying to protect Soviet interests and preserve the unity of the coalition. The Polish question was the most acute. The USSR insisted on recognizing the Curzon Line as the eastern border of Poland, which meant the annexation of western Ukraine and western Belarus to the Soviet Union. In compensation, Poland was to receive German territories in the west. Britain supported the Polish government in exile in London, which refused to accept these terms. Maisky conducted difficult negotiations with the Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile, Stanisław Mikołajczyk. The meetings were tense. The Poles accused the USSR of seizing their lands, while Maisky appealed to historical justice and strategic interests. No compromise was reached. Churchill tried to mediate, but even he could not convince the Poles to agree to the Soviet terms. In the spring of 1944, an event occurred that exacerbated the Polish crisis. The Germans discovered mass graves of Polish officers shot in 1940 in the Katyn forest. Goebbels' propaganda blamed the USSR for this. The Soviet government denied responsibility, claiming that the executions had been carried out by the Germans. The Polish government in exile demanded an investigation by the Red Cross, which led to a breakdown in diplomatic relations with the USSR. May had to defend the official Soviet version, even though he may have had his doubts. Katyn became a poisoned topic in relations between the Allies. The British preferred not to discuss it publicly, but in private conversations, diplomats made it clear that they did not believe the Soviet explanations. This undermined trust at a time when it was critically important. In the summer of 1944, the Red Army entered Polish territory. Stalin began to form a pro-Soviet government, the Polish Committee of National Liberation, which was to become an alternative to the London-based government in exile. Churchill protested, demanding the creation of a coalition government with the participation of the London Poles. Maisky conveyed these demands to Moscow, but the answers were invariably negative. The August uprising in Warsaw was the tragic culmination of the Polish crisis. The Polish Home Army rose up against the Germans, counting on the help of the approaching Red Army. But Soviet troops stopped on the eastern bank of the Vistula and did not help the insurgents. The Germans brutally suppressed the uprising, destroyed Warsaw, and killed tens of thousands of Poles. Britain begged the USSR to help the rebels. Churchill personally appealed to Stalin to organize air deliveries of weapons to the rebels, or at least allow British planes to land at Soviet airfields after dropping their cargo. Stalin refused, calling the uprising an adventure. Maisky was horrified. He understood that the USSR's inaction would lead to disaster and undermine relations with the Allies. In the fall of 1944, Churchill flew to Moscow for talks with Stalin. Maisky did not participate in these talks. His time as the main mediator between the USSR and Britain was coming to an end. At a meeting in the Kremlin, Churchill and Stalin divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, sketching out the proportions on a piece of paper. It was realpolitik in its most cynical form. By the end of 1944, it had become clear that the alliance was held together only by the need to defeat Germany. As soon as the common enemy was defeated, the struggle for the redivision of Europe would begin. Maisky understood this better than most. Having spent 11 years in London observing the evolution of relations from hostility through alliance to a new confrontation. History was repeating itself, and this cycle seemed inevitable. In early 1945, when victory over Germany was already evident, Maisky received unexpected news from Moscow. He was being recalled from his post as ambassador. His 11-year mission in London was coming to an end. Officially, it was called a transfer to a new position, Deputy People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the USSR. In fact, it was the end of Maisky's diplomatic career, although he did not yet know it. The recall was not a reward for successful work. In Moscow, suspicions were growing about diplomats who had been abroad for too long. Maisky had spent more than 10 years in London, becoming familiar with British society and establishing friendly relations with Western politicians. For Stalin, this was dangerous. Such a person could become too independent and unpredictable. New people were needed, who were unquestioningly loyal to the leader. Farewell to London was bitter. Maisky had grown to love this city. Its fog and parks, its libraries and theaters, even its prim gentlemen and extravagant ladies. He had spent the best part of his life here and achieved the greatest successes of his career. As he left, he knew that he would probably never return. His premonition proved correct. His British friends threw him a farewell party. Churchill received Maisky for a farewell audience, thanked him for his contribution to the common victory, and expressed hope for further cooperation. The Labour Party organized a gala dinner. Salon hostesses invited him to their last tea parties. Everyone understood that it was not just a diplomat who was leaving, but a man who had been a living bridge between two worlds. In Moscow, Maisky received a cold welcome. His new position was an honorary one, but it gave him no real power. Molotov, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, did not trust Maisky, considering him too pro-Western. Stalin kept his distance. The former ambassador felt out of place in the People's Commissariat. No one was interested in his opinion, and he was not allowed to participate in important decisions. It was a painful fall from the pinnacle of influence. Maisky participated in the preparation of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, but his role was secondary. The main negotiations were conducted by Stalin, Molotov, and a new generation of diplomats. Maisky's experience was not in demand. He wrote notes, prepared reports, and attended meetings, but his voice was lost among the others. The time of the old guard of diplomats was passing. The war ended in May 1945. Maisky could be proud. He had made an enormous contribution to the victory. Without his efforts to organize Lend-Lease, without his work to form the anti-Hitler coalition, without his influence on British public opinion, the war might have turned out differently. But in Moscow, no one remembered this. The merits of diplomats were attributed to the wise leadership of the leader. In 1946, Maisky was appointed representative of the USSR to the UN Reparations Commission. It was important work, but not comparable to the post of ambassador in London. He traveled around Europe, assessed German assets, and participated in negotiations on reparations payments. The work was boring and bureaucratic. Maisky missed London, real diplomacy, and the feeling of importance of what was happening. In 1947, a storm broke out. The so-called Leningrad Affair led to the arrest of prominent party and state figures. The wave of repression reached the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs. Maisky was accused of spying for Britain, arrested, and tried in a closed court. The sentence was 6 years in the camps. The British friend of the USSR became an enemy of the people. Maisky spent several years in the camps. He was released only after Stalin's death in 1953. Rehabilitation came in 1955. But his diplomatic career was irrevocably over. Maisky devoted the remaining years of his life to writing his memoirs, which became an invaluable source on the history of Soviet diplomacy. He died in 1975, outliving almost all the heroes of his memoirs. Ivan Maisky's legacy in the history of diplomacy cannot be overestimated. His 11 years in London are a unique example of how one person can influence the course of world events through the power of persuasion, knowledge, and patient work. Maisky did not command armies or make strategic decisions, but his contribution to the victory over fascism was enormous. He built bridges where only an abyss seemed possible. Maisky's main achievement was the creation of a working alliance between the USSR and Great Britain, despite mutual distrust and ideological hostility. When he arrived in London in 1932, relations between the two countries were in deep crisis. When he left in 1945, the USSR and Britain were allies who had won the war together. This transition was largely due to his efforts. The Lend-Lease program was the practical embodiment of the alliance. Thousands of tanks, planes, trucks, tons of ammunition and food saved millions of Soviet lives. Maisky personally supervised each convoy, solved every problem, and sought to increase supplies. His persistence annoyed the British, but they respected him for his professionalism and dedication. His influence on British public opinion was no less important. Maisky transformed the USSR from a bogeyman into an ally in the eyes of millions of Britons. His articles, speeches, and interviews shaped the image of the Soviet Union as a country heroically fighting against a common enemy. Of course, this was a romanticized image that concealed the dark side of Stalin's regime. But in wartime, propaganda was a weapon no less important than tanks and planes. Maisky's relationship with Churchill demonstrated his diplomatic skills. Convincing an irreconcilable anti-communist of the need for an alliance with the Bolsheviks was an almost impossible task. But Maisky succeeded in finding common ground with the British Prime Minister. They never became friends, but mutual respect and a common goal created the basis for fruitful cooperation. The struggle for a second front was less successful. For 3 years, Maisky sought to open a front in Western Europe, but the Allies postponed the landing again and again. Millions of Soviet soldiers died, while Britain and the United States gathered their forces. To be fair, the military reasons for the delay were real. A premature landing could have ended in disaster, but until the end of his life, Maisky considered the Allies' delay to be a betrayal. The tragedy of the repressions became a bitter irony of fate. A man who had served the Soviet state all his life renounced his Menshevik beliefs for the Bolsheviks and worked tirelessly for the victory of the USSR. This man was declared an enemy of the people and thrown into the camps. Stalin's paranoia spared no one, not even the most loyal servants of the regime. Maisky survived only because of the dictator's death. Maisky's memoirs, Memoirs of a Soviet Diplomat, have become a classic of diplomatic literature. Written after his rehabilitation, they provide a unique inside look at the events of World War II, the mechanisms of decision-making, and the personalities of the leaders. Of course, as a Soviet author, Maisky could not write with complete candor, and many topics remained taboo. But even with the censorship, his books are an invaluable historical source. The paradox of Maisky is that he was both a victim and a creator of history. A victim because he became a hostage of the system he served, suffered repression, and was morally broken. He was a creator because his actions influenced the course of the war, helped form the anti-Hitler coalition, and saved lives. This duality makes him a particularly interesting figure to study. Today, Maisky is almost forgotten by the general public. His name is known to historians and diplomats, but not to ordinary people. This is unfair. A man who represented the USSR for 11 years during the most critical period in history deserves to be remembered. His experience shows that diplomacy is not only about protocols and ceremonies, but also about the daily work of building trust between people and nations. In today's world, full of conflict and misunderstanding, this experience is more relevant than ever.